how to run customer success in HubSpot is what we're going to be talking about today. This is a question that we get a lot. Is it possible? And more importantly, and what we're going to really cover in the bulk of this workshop, how do you actually go about doing it? How do you set up HubSpot sort of on day one to get everything in place to run things post-sale? And we'll also get into some sort of fun workflow automation, some critical moments in the customer journey, and some reporting as well to sort of think about how you keep everything together and ultimately empowering your team to best serve the customer. So as we just talked about, we'll get into why should you do it, how to set it up, and then automated workflows and reporting. As I mentioned, there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you have anything that's specific, either drop it in the chat, we'll cover it as we go, or we will also have some time at the end for questions as well. So really quick introductions. I'm Stuart Bolcom. I run marketing and sort of go-to-market at Arrows. Spend a bunch of time in HubSpot building stuff for our own team, but also for exploring use cases and sort of interesting problems in the customer success space in HubSpot. For some high-level context, Arrows is a software product that connects directly to HubSpot to give your customers a sort of customer-facing collaborative plan to use during onboarding and other sort of key moments in the customer journey when you need to work towards an outcome together. I'm joined by Shareil Narriman, who's head of customer success at Arrows, and has previously led onboarding and sort of success teams, built large-scale success programs at places like Sprout Social and Booking.com. Hey, Shareil.
Howdy. Thanks for having me as always, and good to meet everyone. It's obviously a huge topic and an ongoing topic, but a lot of value in my mind, at least in like figuring out how do you centralize as much of this customer information as possible in one place, and ideally give the rest of your teams, product and marketing and sales and post-sales visibility into all of that. So this topic is definitely near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, it's interesting that this is a thing that we are continually building and sort of iterating on ourselves at Arrows with using HubSpot for customer success, and it's sort of it's an interesting, gets meta very quickly.
Right. And the truth is it's hard. Like it's if anyone is on this call, they probably realize it's hard, and we're all in this together. So please jump in with questions and thoughts, because when we get that's the kind of stuff Stuart and I can try and go figure out and try and go build and come back hopefully with more of this content for future workshops.
For sure. And that sort of is a good segue into this sort of big question, like why should you even try to run customer success in HubSpot? What's sort of the case for running customer success in HubSpot? There's plenty of tools that are sort of marketed much more directly to customer success teams. You could buy a CS platform that is solely focused on customer success. But there are a few reasons why HubSpot as a tool, as sort of the framework that we'll sort of walk through, has a ton of advantages for teams that want to run sort of customer centric and a process that ultimately is making customers successful. So the first, HubSpot is really good at forcing process. And one thing that we'll talk about specifically in these workshops when it comes to that is HubSpot has pipelines, as many CRMs do, but HubSpot has pipelines that are sort of specifically designed for the purpose of moving customers through a defined process. So it's taking them from where they are today to an outcome that they want to reach. And there's all sorts of interesting things that you can do to help both enable your own team to run an effective process. And ultimately that's running an effective process is sort of the key to building a process that scales. So both enable your own team to run an effective process, but make sure that you're able to iterate and improve that process over time to better serve customers. Second, increasing visibility, and this is one Shareil sort of already alluded to this a little bit. The big advantage of using something like HubSpot over a dedicated CS-specific tool is that ultimately the customer journey and interactions that customers have with your company go far beyond just your CS team. So having everybody in the company or your customer-facing teams in the company in a single tool really does help increase visibility, gives you access to customer activity across teams, so email, internal notes, calls, everything that's going into communicating and building context around that customer is all going to be in one place in HubSpot. And sort of connected to that is connecting the customer experience. This is something that we'll get into pretty specifically. We're going to talk about the sales to onboarding and success handoff. But having your teams together in one place makes it much, much easier to provide a sort of continuous and a consistent customer experience because you do have all the data in one place. You don't have the situation where your sales team has data in one place and then success team has data in another place, and neither team has visibility into what's happening in different stages of the journey. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's really difficult to get things right the first time around and to build something from scratch that is going to be what you ultimately need when you're at a different size or serving different customers. So being able to build a continuous feedback loop in a tool that both allows you to sort of automate the really tedious parts, but also make sure that you're feeding data back from about what's happening to other teams, to your team, and really build that loop and help your team focus on the things that are actually the highest leverage is a really big advantage of having everything together in one place in HubSpot. So that's sort of the end of the spiel, I guess, about why HubSpot, or why we believe HubSpot makes a lot of sense for a customer success team that is trying to serve customers and sort of scale their ability to do that. So we're going to jump into HubSpot itself. We're going to walk through how sort of thinking about setting up your account specifically. What are the properties? What are the objects? What are the different ways that you can set up HubSpot to work for customer success? Before I'm going to switch over to HubSpot, but Shareil, I know you've built CS and onboarding teams at scale. Like, I know you sort of felt this problem pretty viscerally of not having the data that you need or needing the data that you need to sort of more effectively do the job. What's something that, if you had to point to sort of the biggest advantage of having everything in HubSpot or running success in HubSpot, how does it impact your role as a CS leader? What does it enable you to do that you might not be able to do otherwise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is not by any means to say CS platforms aren't great. I think they are all great. I've used them in the past. I use them, and I think they are powerful tools. I think there's all sorts of integrations that different products can have into your CRM, like HubSpot. Where I find it advantageous, at least starting in a single point, is maybe part of the obvious of all the data is in one place. The root of that, though, is most folks come to us, and even when I've done consulting and advising in the past, everyone's trying to build a process. And everyone's trying to build something that's repeatable, and everyone's trying to ultimately scale it and get it to grow and do more. And the truth is that's really hard to do, period. And it's even harder to do across multiple platforms and multiple tools, because essentially what we're creating is individual data silos, which in and of themselves aren't a problem. It's when those data silos can't talk to each other and connect to everything in one place, and you're trying to build a process in that world. That part gets very difficult. That's what's frustrating. There are components of HubSpot that we're not naive to this fact. There are other tools that might do individual pieces of this better than HubSpot as a platform, or even Salesforce as a platform, or any other individual tool as a platform. But because it can do so much, and you can get all the data in one place, enough of the data to draw conclusions, to make hypotheses, to say this is or isn't working, to dig into, to share across your team, having all of that, especially when I put my CS leader hat on, and being able to influence sales and influence marketing and influence product, because all that information is in one place. And what that tangibly looks like is, if you're looking at a pipeline for onboarding, for example, and 20 of your customers are stuck on a single task, you can at least identify who was their deal owner, what happened in the sales notes, what happened in that marketing flow. So being able to, at this point, most of us have hypotheses, and being able to at least quickly find some data to validate that, even if it's surface level or even if it's a small segment of data, but being able to do that and do it on my own is why I like having access to all of this in a CRM. So I can go in there and quickly and build a quick report or build a quick list and at least get the information I want. And sure, I've worked in places and even here where you have these large databases and huge BI tools, and all of that is also helpful. But I don't think you can get anywhere to that point without starting in a singular place. And most people at your company should be in the CRM and already have seats in there. So that is why I love it. And then in our case, obviously, when I can layer in something like arrows over the top of that and have a customer facing experience that is pretty smooth and see all that data and visibility on the HubSpot side, it's just made my life a lot easier when it comes to putting together business cases, when it comes to actually coaching my teams on what is and isn't working. And honestly, highlighting what's missing. Like, you don't really know what's missing or how to build a process until you start digging into some of that. And so you can at least quickly identify, all right, this piece actually is a problem. Let me go buy a tool or look into other avenues for it. But starting in here, and we use it, I mean, we predominantly use HubSpot to run marketing, run sales, run onboarding, and run ongoing CS. And it just makes it easy, makes it easier to review stuff. It makes it easier to sit with the team and see where things are broken. It makes it easier to identify how to go fix those things. All of that is still hard work. At least the starting point, though, helps me flag some of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that often problems that you see in one stage of the journey have, you know, either the entire root cause or at least some part of the cause is in a different stage of the journey, and being able to point to the data when it comes to getting buy-in from another team to go make a change, or get budget to go implement
Right.
something, becomes much, much easier when you're able to actually point to the data
Right.
in one
Right.
place.
And just learn. Like, you don't know what you don't know. So I can sit here all day and say that was a bad lead, or that was a bad marketing contact, or that was a poor onboarding. But until I can prove some of that with data, which HubSpot lets me do pretty quickly, um, it's hard to make those types of statements and ultimately change product direction or influence different departments or so on.
Totally, totally. So let's talk about setting up HubSpot. What we're looking at here is a company record. The reason that we're starting here, and this is something that I think is really important when you're looking at the impact of, customer success has a huge impact on the ultimate success of a customer, the total revenue that you're able to generate from a customer, and being able to use the company record as sort of a 360-degree view of an account is really helpful. So this is typically the first place that we start, and in HubSpot, the reason that we use the company record as opposed to a deal or a ticket or a contact is that everything rolls up into a company. You can associate everything with a company. So just to sort of walk through how we set this up, how we think about this, and everything here is sort of out of the box HubSpot. There's nothing, we're not doing anything too crazy here. This should all be available to in your account. There are a few things that we'll talk about that will depend on the specific tier of HubSpot. We'll sort of mention those as we go, but everything here is HubSpot. So to go start on this left-hand side, we like to customize this left sidebar and the nice thing about HubSpot is you can customize these views depending on who is viewing them. So you can make these sidebar views specific to your customer success team if you want to show sales something different, for example. But we're trying to pull out what are the most critical pieces of information at the account level that we want to see. So when is their renewal date? How much are they expected to renew for? What segment of customer are they? Do they have a future QBR scheduled? What is their health score? And we'll talk about health scoring more specifically later, which is a huge rabbit hole in itself. But pulling that out at the account level, who is the ultimately the responsible CSM for this account? And then below that, we pull onboarding into its own sort of section here with less information here, but who is responsible for onboarding? What was the plan? In this case, we're attaching a customer-facing errors plan for onboarding. What is the URL of that plan so we can go access it and open it up if we need to? And then what is the status of their onboarding? Other things that you might think about including here potentially are, who was the initial, or who is the account manager, who is the sales rep, like who are all the people who are responsible for this account in different roles. So it's the left sidebar. On the right, to jump over here, we have essentially all our associations with this account. So we might have, in this case, we have two contacts. We could have any number of contacts associated here with this company. We have the deals. You'll see here that we have renewal deals in here as well. We'll talk about that as how we're tracking individual renewals a little bit later, but we have individual renewals here. And this is one thing that sort of gets into one of the core concepts that we talk about here is having a specific record, an individual discrete record for each stage of the customer journey. So having a sales deal, having individual renewal deals, and then down below we have a ticket, in this case for onboarding. The big advantage of having individual records for each stage is it makes it much, much easier from a reporting perspective to pull things out and say, okay, we want to look at renewals compared to each other. We want to look at onboardings compared to each other. And then at the account level, how many years have they renewed? Have they increased their renewal amount each year? Have they contracted? Like, it makes it much, much easier if you're pulling everything into individual records to do that kind of reporting.
We focus so much on lifetime value when it comes to customers, and how do you keep them around longer, and how do you get them to expand and grow the revenue, and ultimately what all of these individual things are just small peaks into that entire life cycle. And the more of that you have captured and timestamped, the better chance you have to say, all right, it takes X amount of time to get a customer to activate it. It takes X amount of time for them to be adopted. Or the flip side of that is they are not healthy because they are not doing ABC, and we've seen patterns and themes in other cohorts that got to that moment in time. So those, what seems like sometimes just additional work, like those small timestamps and those small moments in time overall help you actually build that process and scale towards what I believe most folks are after, which is increasing lifetime value and making sure that all that acquisition cost that was spent getting a customer to become one isn't instantly gone to waste and sticks around, and you see that full value from them, while obviously also giving you more time to deliver the promise that your service said that it could, or the product said it would.
Totally. And then down below this, we use these things less often, but everything, all the other types of object and sort of features in HubSpot would also be associated with this account too. The final thing to mention, and perhaps the most important one, we talked about it already in the sort of why centralize things in HubSpot, is this sort of central activity feed. So this is going to have everything that is going on for an account. Everything that's happening in a deal can be associated back here. All the communication that's happening in a deal can be associated back here. Everything that's happening in tickets can be associated back here. And then what can happen if you have an account that has been with you for any kind of length of time is that this gets really messy. There's just a lot of stuff in here. There's potentially a long timeline of activities. So we sort of use this snippet, this note snippet at the top here, and pin it to provide sort of a high-level summary of what is going on with this account. What do they do? What are their goals for using, signing up and using our product? And are there any extra notes or any context which anybody who's just sort of checking in on this account, trying to get a high-level overview, would need to, effectively get context and help out this account? So that's the company record. Shareil, anything else to add on this spot before we move on to workflows? I know you're furiously typing away there.
Yeah, I was kind of responding to Lynn's question in the chat here, which is somewhat related to what you're saying too. At the company level, I want the highest level information where if my boss, who's our CEO, has questions for me, he can open any company record and get a pretty holistic glimpse into what's happening. So who is responsible for that account from a CSM, from a sales, from an onboarding standpoint? When is their next big milestone? Is it a renewal? Is it a QBR? Is it a cancellation conversation? What's the general health of that customer? And in that middle column, this pinned note and template or snippet I use it's basically sales notes, onboarding notes, CSM notes, and I keep individual notes for every call I have below that. And kind of to touch on Lynn's point, sometimes I associate that only with that individual deal or ticket if it's not super important to the bigger picture. But in here, I want anyone in the company, whether you've worked here a day or 10 years, to be able to come see, here is this company, here is ultimately what they do, here are their core goals for our product, and any high level information that I would need to know. So if my old boss used to use this analogy, if Shareil, you won the lottery and left tomorrow, I want to be able to pick that up and know exactly who to reach out to and what to do and what the next steps kind of there are. So at the company level, to me, it's those bits of notes. And then as you get into each contact or each deal or each ticket, and that's kind of the beauty of the association hierarchy, You can go deeper into there. You can leave detailed notes. You can, in here, I don't have, for example, clips of recordings of calls. But on that individual onboarding ticket, I might include some of that, or I might include the total call, or I might include detailed notes in there. The other advantage with automations and workflows is as you capture some of that information on those smaller objects, you can roll it up to here. So an example of this is like the onboarding status. I don't actually come into the company record and update that onboarding status. That's a workflow looking at my onboarding ticket, and it's looking at the status of the plan attached to it. So it's always up to date for Stuart if he wants to come and look at it. But behind the scenes, I'm doing my job at the ticket level.
Yeah, that's absolutely true of, things like renewal dates and stuff like that as well. Like that's where having a defined process for specific moments in the journey and being able to sort of define them in workflows is really helpful. So let's jump over there and talk about one of the you know probably the biggest impact, at least if you're talking about getting a customer set up on the right foot. One of the biggest impact areas for most teams is the sales to onboarding and success sort of handoff. And one thing that we like to do here is to define, as I just mentioned, define that process in a mixture of pipelines and workflows. So what I mean by that is if I go to pipelines, we have a pipeline for, and certainly recommend this as well, have a pipeline for sales, which is going to be owned by the sales team, probably already exists if your sales team is using HubSpot, and then create a separate pipeline using either tickets or deals. And that's a question we can certainly get into for the next step. So for us, we have an onboarding pipeline using deals here. We also have one in tickets as well, that look, pretty similar. They're just using different objects inside of HubSpot. So the advantage of having multiple pipelines, one for each stage of the customer journey, is that you can have different teams working in different pipelines. You can define the stages that are going to be specific to that stage of the journey, but you can also require the information that you're going to need to move both between those pipelines in a workflow, but also within those pipelines using required properties in HubSpot. So for example, if you know that before we can go live, we need to have set up the account, we need to have collected this specific piece of information, we need to have signed this legal agreement, whatever it might be that you need to move to the next milestone, you can define that in a required property, which if I go back to our sales pipeline, now when I move go to move a deal to closed one, you'll see this particular deal has a lot of these properties, or all these properties already filled out, but we can define the things that we're going to absolutely need to be known to move this customer forward in onboarding and success in the required properties. So things like, this is a very bad example, but let's say they wanted to reduce churn 15% by the end of the quarter, or by the end of the year. These hopefully are things that are being captured in, and this is obviously where having both your sales team and your success team in the same tool is really helpful, because you can start to have a conversation about, what are these things that we need, but you also have a central point to say, are we collecting these things? How are there particular deals from particular reps, not to point fingers, but to give feedback on, are there particular areas in the process that can be improved? Are there particular things that get captured in a way that aren't helpful for us in the next step of the journey? So you can fill in these fields, but the point here is that we're checking that these fields are correct so that when we go on to the next stage of the process, we can move the deal into this new pipeline, knowing that we have everything we need to make the customer successful. And we can do that using a workflow. So if I open up this workflow here, we have we have two workflows for managing our sales to onboarding handoff, and I'll explain why. The first is going to be triggered when we move a deal in our sales pipeline to closed one. So we have a new customer who is ready for onboarding. And this one is essentially going to create all the new objects, all the new records that we're going to need for the future stages of the customer journey. So we can use this workflow to check that all the properties we need are available. These should also be in our required fields. So this is just kind of a fallback. We can say, if those things aren't ready, then we can actually move forward with this deal. We need to send an email or notify the person who was meant to be filling in those fields that this thing's missing, and that we need to get that updated. And then in here, we're creating those future records that I mentioned. So this one, we are creating a new renewal deal in our renewal pipeline. We're using deals for renewals because they have a dollar value associated to them. That's really the big difference, at least between deals and tickets, is that by default, deals have dollar values associated with them. So they're much better for tracking and reporting on commercial activity, whereas tickets do not. So we're creating a new deal in the renewal pipeline. We're setting a close date. We're assuming an annual renewal here. You could handle this differently if you don't have annual renewals. We're setting a close date on the renewal deal. And then we're copying over all the sort of critical properties, the critical information that we want to know about that deal to the renewal deal. And then we're also creating a ticket, in this case, in our onboarding pipeline in the ready for onboarding stage. And again, copying over all of the relevant information that we need to know in that stage of the journey. Finally, we just send a Slack notification that says, hey, we closed a new deal. That's great. They are hoping to achieve X. So that's step one.
No, that was just to add to that. This is so powerful in my own world in the day to day because it does two things. It stops me from having to go chase down a sales rep and ask a question, which is first a time suck. And we all do it. This is not to say like anyone's perfect at it, us included. There's always going to be a few missing fields or notes that are not fully completed. But the more you can prevent that, it saves internal time, obviously, between that back and forth with your teams. And I think just as, if not more importantly, it stops me from asking a customer a question the second, third, fourth time that they've already been asked or have already answered, and ultimately gives me a better chance to get to a point of having meaningful strategy conversation and digging into the why to stuff instead of just focusing on gathering information that should have already been collected at some other point in that life cycle. So obviously that's in the real world. We always have those challenges. We always have those gaps. The handoffs are tough for everybody. How do we make sure customers feel the least amount of that pain and ourselves internally become more efficient?
For sure, for sure. And so then the second part of the sort of onboard or sales to onboarding handoff is going to be creating or setting up everything that we need for the specific onboarding stage. So we copied over all our information. As you'll see here, this is looking at our onboarding ticket. When a new ticket is created for onboarding in our onboarding pipeline, we are going to set up the things that we need. So this is where it gets really interesting and really powerful by being able to define your process in data, is that you can start to use the data that you have about a customer from different stages of the life cycle to customize or personalize the experience that customer is going to get in a future stage. So in this case, we're keeping it pretty simple, but we're looking at, were they marked as an enterprise customer or as an SMB customer? Maybe that's a pretty broad split, but maybe they purchased this product versus that product, or this set of products versus this set of products. Maybe they paid for a migration, or they paid for implementation, or they did not. We want to be able to treat those customers differently, provide them with a different experience that fits what they were sold in sales, but B, what's ultimately going to help them get to the outcomes that they want to reach. So based on that, you can set up a renewal date. There's other ways to do this as well, but you could create a renewal date in this workflow. But then this is where we sort of get into the most important part of this workflow. Is based on the type of customer, we can rotate them to a specific owner on our onboarding team and use a different team if we have different segments of customers, and that's the way that we're handling that. So in this case, we're rotating to the enterprise onboarding team, in this case, to the SMB onboarding team. The reason for using teams, and you certainly can assign to specific people, even if you were a team of one, I would still recommend creating a team in HubSpot and rotating the ticket in that team, even if it is always going to go to the same person. The reason being, it makes it much, much easier later on, if you have that set up, to add additional people. If that person leaves and you're replacing them with somebody else, then you don't have to change anything in your workflow. You don't have to disrupt how the assignments and subsequent things work after that. This will sort of handle that for future states as well. Next up, and Shareil sort of already mentioned this a little bit, is making sure that the customer isn't feeling any gaps or any sort of rough edges in our handoff process. A great way to do that is by giving them an experience that shows them what's next. We're doing that in this case by attaching an arrows customer-facing plan for onboarding. You could also do this earlier in the sales process, but we're just creating it using a different template depending on the type of customer that we're working with. And then we copy that, the URL that we're going to use to access that plan into a property. And in this case, we're sending a welcome email. Otherwise, we're just going right ahead to this prep for handoff sort of internal task. And the really nice thing here is that you can, by defining everything in a workflow, you're able to not only save your team time on the sort of implementation and the details of having to go do all these steps, but you're also able to more effectively report on when things don't happen, right? So are we missing data at any point in this workflow? Well, let's create a task, send a notification, alert our team that happened. We can also report on the number of deals that have passed through this process that were missing data, or the customers who went through this process, or this segment of customers versus that segment of customers, and what happened to them in onboarding and how they were able to move through the next stage of the journey. Shareil, I know this is a thing that you see a lot with our customers because we work with onboarding teams all the time. Is there's often sort of friction or pain in this handoff from sales to onboarding and success. What's something that you found? What's been the biggest learning for you on sort of that front in terms of how it's all very well sort of defining this in a workflow? It seems really easy, right? But there's often some kind of internal friction or internal pushback about changes that potentially influence other teams. How do you handle that, and how do you sort of start to have that conversation internally with teams?
Yeah, it's for me, it's two things. One, that friction causes a lot of frustration for customers because in that moment of time, if you and I don't know why a customer is stuck or where they are stuck, chances are the customer also doesn't know. And for them, who is likely paying you already at that point, and or has just come off this really high experience of sales was great, marketing was great, we're going to get this thing going. Every marketing site you see out there says it's going to be fast to deploy and time to value is super easy and it's going to be all great, and then it's not. And now you have potentially dampened that initial positive first impression that customer was thinking about. So first and foremost, when that's the case, think about how the customer is experiencing or feeling that and bring that into the conversation. The second piece is more of a business problem and or focus, which is we're talking about revenue. I mean, you spent a lot of time and effort closing these deals, and now there is literal revenue stuck somewhere in your pipeline. Whether that's your fault or not, it is the case. And until that customer can continue to make progress and become onboarded and start to see the value of the product and start using it and activating and all those buzzwords and jargon that we know about, that is plain and simply revenue stuck somewhere in your pipeline. And I have we use kind of a handoff stage, if you will, between sales and success, and it's this ready for onboarding stage. But ultimately what that does for me is ties a dollar amount to all of these accounts or deals that are now sitting between what is this handoff, and they're stuck for whatever reason that is, whether it's a bandwidth issue, whether it's just a timeline issue, whether that customer has told you they're not ready to keep going and you don't have that visibility, right? So automations like this, in my mind, help reduce the likelihood of that customer getting stuck there. And the more it's reduced down to the individual data points or those properties or whatever it is, it helps you at least answer or identify why they are stuck a little bit easier. So if we have this in our own world where one of our metrics is, or one of our properties is success metric. Success metric is what did that customer show up to arrows for in the first place. If that property is missing, and we have a filter and a report that shows when that property is or isn't missing, it's going to be really hard for them to be successful in onboarding because we don't know what they showed up for in the first place. Now, whether that note lives somewhere in Slack, whether that note lives in a demo, whether that note lives in someone's head, that's all great. how do we get to make sure that that's in that property? And so we have workflows that can push it back. We have workflows that pinpoint that that thing is missing. I can go in there obviously and manually see that. That's one of my high level properties in that company record in our own HubSpot account that Stuart was referring to, where I can quickly identify, I don't have this information. So the sooner you can identify those things, the more likely you are to speed up that process. Ultimately, the best experience is for your customers to not feel that moment in time where they are stuck. They don't care if me and Stuart are arguing back and forth about a deal missing information, or if a deal was or wasn't qualified, or where it got stuck in market. Like, that's not for the customer to worry about. They need to worry about what to do, how to go do that thing, and where to go do it. That's where having a really powerful customer facing plan or version of that process is critical, so that even if you are behind the scenes, which in theory we are doing all the time, is changing our process, right? And that might mean changing pipelines, that might mean adding additional steps, that might mean changing phases, changing tasks, doing all those bits. Customers don't care, nor should they. They need to know what to do, how to go do it, and how to start using your product. And the better environment you can foster for that to be true, that's where, in my mind, automations, workflows, all of these bits become critical, because they, again, reduce the need for us internally to spend time doing things that might have already been done earlier in the life cycle. That way, too, when customers really do get stuck, now at least you have a new thing to go solve for. It's another reason. And I'm always trying to proactively answer those questions, or basically break down those gaps in the process earlier and earlier and earlier in the life cycle. Again, why having all those pipelines for the different moments in time can be of value. That way, by the time it comes to have a renewal conversation, it is not a renewal conversation. It is, hey, this has been going great. It's a no-brainer. Let's keep going with this. When it comes time for that QBR, it is, I'm here to understand more of what I can do. What is the strategy here? What more can, same with onboarding. Like, if you get a chance to have 2 or 3 onboarding calls with the customer and they're an hour or 2 each, you want to spend as much of that time as possible talking about the strategy of your product, not showing them how to click around or how to set things up. Now, we all have to do that, obviously, because of UI and complex products and integrations and all those bits. But the faster you can do that, the more time, again, you have to spend on strategy, on optimizing that strategy, on getting into all the advanced bits and features of our products that we all like to show off. None of that is possible unless you have these early moments figured out and thought through.
Ultimately, being able to identify the gaps early and sort of build a process around closing those gaps makes it much easier to be proactive with the
Right.
time that you're spending directly with customers. Okay, so we have a good number of things that we can get into. We have less than 20 minutes here. This is always the way that this workshop goes for everybody watching. If there are questions that we do not end up getting to, because some of these are big topics, I will send individual videos on how to do each of those things. So I'm going to dive into renewals, because that is a big one. Hopefully every company is thinking about renewals. What happens after that first year? After the initial sale, how do we make sure that customers are continuing to come back, continuing to pay, continuing to expand, hopefully. And the way that we're managing that is, as we mentioned already, and as we sort of alluded to in the workflow in the sales handoff, is in a separate pipeline for renewals. And this pipeline is organized by time to renewal. So we have 6 to 12, 3 to 6, 2 to 3, 1 month until renewal, and then ultimately closed one is they renewed, right? If closed last would be they churned in this case. And the way that we're managing this pipeline is predominantly with workflows. The really great thing about having everything pulled out into stages like this is that you can start to do things proactively. You can start to automate pieces based on the data that you have about a customer. For example, if you are tracking a health score or some kind of usage score or usage metric on an account, and you're piping that into HubSpot, there's a whole nother topic that we could dive into. But if you're tracking that at an account level, then you will be able to say, okay, if a customer has not achieved this milestone, or if they are, if they have this health score when they get to a certain number of months from renewal, well, we need to initiate this. We need to run this playbook. We need to make sure that we are proactively addressing that gap between where we hope they'll be and where we feel confident that they will be renewing, and to Shareil's point, make that renewal a non-event, and where they are today. We want to introduce this new feature or this new level of account usage at a certain point in the journey. We can't do everything up front in onboarding, but once they hit this milestone, once they get to this point, we're going to introduce that. So organizing this way is really helpful from that perspective. But let's dive into the workflows, because there are 3 workflows that we use to sort of manage this pipeline. And Corolla asked a really great question about why, you probably saw this in this folder, why do we have 2 workflows that essentially look the same, but one is named odd and one is named even? I'm going to get to that in just a second, but first I just want to show this workflow, which we're going to use to automate the movement of deals through the pipeline based on how long they have until renewal. So in this pipeline, or in this workflow, sorry, we can use we have a days until renewal property, which is calculated based on the renewal date and today's date and the difference between those two in a calculated property. And then we are just introducing branches for each of these stages, the sort of time to renewal stages that we want in number of days. And then based on that, we're just setting the stage of a particular deal to the one that matches. So if you have days to renewal is less than or equal to 30, well, then we're putting them in this 1 month bucket in this case. If we get data that we're not expecting, and I would always recommend doing this in workflows, whatever you're setting up a workflow for, if you have data that you're not expecting, always have an else branch in your workflow and just catch it, create a task, send an email, make sure that you do not have things silently failing in your workflows, and you're not notified, your team isn't notified and able to go fix it. So that's one. That one's pretty simple. To Corolla's question, the reason that we have two workflows which are essentially doing the same thing, we're going to look at this and you're probably like, why do these look exactly the same? The reason is that HubSpot doesn't allow you to create or to recreate objects using the same from an object that has already entered the workflow. The reason that they do that is they don't want you to create an infinite number of objects. You could set up a workflow wrong and sort of overload everything by potentially creating objects indefinitely. So we're using 2 workflows and essentially bouncing between the 2 depending on the renewal year. So in this workflow, when we have a deal that's closed won in our renewal pipeline, and in this case, we're checking that the renewal year type is odd, which essentially we're just lining that up with, is it renewal year 1, is it renewal year 2, is it renewal year 3? If it's odd, then we're going to run this workflow. We're going to immediately set renewal year type to even. As I mentioned, that's to just make sure that we flip-flop to the other workflow for the next renewal, so that we're not using the same workflow to create the renewal deal back-to-back. As we looked at earlier, we copy the value of the amount of the renewal onto the company record. You can also copy the renewal date in here as well. And then we go ahead and create a new renewal deal. We set up we have a calculated property called next renewal year, which is renewal year plus 1, so that we can dynamically name our deals. We set the close date to a year out, and then we just copy over all the relevant properties from this deal. So the advantage of setting this up in a workflow, of course, is that you don't need to manually recreate all of these deals. You can if you're running a large volume of these through, they should all run through by themselves. And because you're automating progression through the pipeline, you can set any sort of checks or specific milestones that you want to take an action, run a playbook, and go ahead and intervene with a customer as they do that. And you can sort of be proactively notified that you need to go do something rather than having to individually check each deal to check on its status. So that is renewals. Corolla, any specifically, or anybody else, any other questions on renewals? Otherwise, we can move quickly to sort of health scoring and reporting. I know the question that Lynn asked was a great question. Measuring time in onboarding, measuring time to a specific action. I can show that really quickly as part of health scoring as well. Um, but health scoring is such an interesting, Shareil, I know you have thoughts on this one. Um, Health scoring is such an interesting topic because it is, everybody wants it, but it is so different. Uh, it's so specific to the company that you're working at in terms of what will go into that health score, and ultimately how you use that health score to drive action, intervention, and make customers successful, which is ultimately what it comes down to, right? Nobody is uh, sure, having great health scores is one thing for your customers, but being able to take the actions that ultimately reduce churn, increase upsells, increase retention, is what it's all about. So Sharon, maybe you can. What's your philosophy on health scoring? I'm going to dive a little bit into the sort of how in HubSpot, but how do you
Yeah.
think about health scoring and like how you use it day to day?
I, I think healthy is really hard. The term healthy is really hard because it's so dependent on that individual customer's, first of all, goals and needs. It's also dependent on their learning style and how they actually absorb and keep information to then go apply it to become what would be considered healthy. I love health scores. I think when used correctly, though, they are more of an indicator that a customer is trending towards unhealthy behaviors or unhealthy patterns. And that is what I'm most concerned about from the lens of like, I'm never picking up a phone and calling a customer and saying, hey, things look great over there. Have a good day. You should do that also, right? You're encouraging that over time. But really, what I'm looking for with that score is an indicator that something is trending towards a pattern that I've seen in the past that leads ultimately to a reduction in product usage, a reduction in product expansion, and ultimately a path towards churn. So I look at health scores from the lens of like, what is this customer's propensity to churn, and can I prevent that either for that customer, or is it too late for that customer and can I learn from it and prevent it for ongoing customers? And so when you unpack that, yes, we have to call it healthy. You have to look for things that customers that are healthy did, and piecing together like what are the most important things that my product we believe is the value, and what is the most important things that customers are coming to us to. Those things should in a perfect world be matching or at least close to matching. And can I measure that to then pinpoint when customers aren't doing that thing and label those as unhealthy, giving everyone else that healthy tag, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's yeah, to your point, it's ultimately what are you going to do with this information? Like what is the thing that we are going to action
Right.
versus just, a nice pretty color. And we can certainly talk about creating the pretty color in this workflow, but
Right.
you know, ultimately the thing that is important is what are you going to do with that information? So keeping it
Yep.
simple is sort of the best starting point. I mean, this workflow uh, is based on a calculated score. There's all sorts of ways that you can set this up to calculate a score. You can, use different inputs, such as you might have things like number of tickets for an account, number of escalations for an account. Uh, the If you have a CSM sort of pulse score, if you're asking your own team how they would rate a customer's health, can often be a good thing to include because you get the sort of qualitative um, side of the score. If you're collecting NPS or CSAT, you can roll all of that up into a health score along with any product usage um, metrics that you're tracking as well. And rolling all that up into a score, once you have that, you can then say, okay, well, if that score is in this range versus that range versus that range, we're going to assign it a high level color. And then we can also set, which way is this trending uh, based on the difference between uh, the current score and the previous score. It's one thing that HubSpot is not great at. So you have to sort of work around a little bit is historical reporting or historical trend reporting on individual properties. So this is sort of one way to do it. You can look at, in this period, are we up or down versus where we were in the previous period. The way that we do health scoring and I don't know if Shareil, you would actually call it a health score, but the way that we do it at Arrows is we pipe in product data, and we essentially have a metric called engaged plans, which looks at the total number of plans that a customer is sending of ours versus the total number of those plans where their customers are being successful in that plan, are taking the action, which is sort of it's not an exact metric, of course, but it is a proxy for effectively using the product to get to the outcome that they want. And then we can look at, what is the percentage of the total plans that a customer has paid for. This is another really good one is what is the sort of consumption of your product, that even if you don't have usage-based pricing or anything like that, like how much of what somebody has paid for are they actually using, whether it's by seat, whether it's by by the actual amount of, if you're billing in units or number of email sends or whatever it is, like what are they using versus what do they pay for, and then you can add that extra layer of, okay, what are they using versus what do they pay for versus what are they using that you're actually seeing as effective usage, and all those things just sort of sit on a scale, right? And the most important thing is that you are looking at your own data compared to your own data, right? Where were we with this particular metric a month ago? Where were we, 6 months ago? Are we trending in the right direction? Are we actively trying to improve the metrics that we care about and sort of iterate against the metric rather than just saying, okay, we have this metric. That's great. We can show a
Totally.
dashboard.
Yeah. I mean, yes, to answer your question, I definitely consider that a health score. It is, I think, the piece that isn't in that example Stuart shared that isn't fully calculated as some of the qualitative components of customer health. But for me, I have that visibility going into checking calls and onboarding calls and QBRs, and I can pair that product usage and product adoption and getting ultimately the thing they're paying for, because we do have a use or a pay per use type model as well. So if you're paying for something, I want to make sure you're getting the most use out of it. So it's a very strong indicator for me going into any of those conversations. And then from there, I can also have that qualitative component, and whether you're using, in-app surveys or CSAT or MPS or any of that, all great indicators, and verbal conversations. Maybe they had an off month. Maybe sales were slow for 1 month, and so they haven't used as many plans. So it's not as concerning to see that. But that's why having some of that visibility ahead of those calls and at the company level is super important, along with some of those notes and some of those details that then go into all the associated objects. So this is a super powerful way for me to get visibility into trends, and then if I want to go deeper, dig into all of those individual components, watch calls, read notes, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And all we're doing here in this report or this dashboard that I'm showing is sort of rolling up all of that information to a high level view of, where are customers, where do customers sit on how many customers do we have in each segment? You could of course further break this down. Like, do we have great health scoring or great health scores amongst this segment of customers versus that segment of customers? Where do individual team members' accounts sit? There's all sorts of all sorts of ways that you can break down this data. Conscious that we are just about at time here. I think we got to a lot of the questions in the chat. Lynn, I'll certainly follow up with some more specific resources on reporting on the onboarding pipeline, reporting on time to specific events. The big one that we use there, and this is something that we use a lot, is time to your first or time between account created and the first plan being sent is specific to ours, or time between the account being created and you reaching some percentage, some threshold of consumption, right? If you paid for 100 plans, when did you first get to 50 used in a period? Because ultimately, I'll show you how to set those up with calculated properties and a workflow, but ultimately establishing that baseline and improving against the baseline is the most effective way to go. But thank you everybody so much for joining. Any questions at all? Any additional things? I know I already have some follow-ups here for questions in the chat, but anything that you want to ask separately, anything that's specific to your business, shoot me or Shareil an email. We'll drop our emails in the chat. Stuart at Arrows, Shareil at at Arrows. If you are looking at improving onboarding specifically, as that sort of moment in the life cycle, would love to talk about that. Hear how you're approaching things, hear sort of what your goals are, where you are. We love to help on that front. If Arrows fits in there, great. If you're looking to run that process in HubSpot and want to give your customers a great experience where they know what's next, they can take that next step and ultimately make progress on their own, give your team sort of higher leverage time when you are together. We can certainly talk about that as well. But any questions, we always want to help. Find us on LinkedIn as well. We always try to share helpful stuff there. But thank you so much to everybody for joining. We will send out the recording, the full recording for this workshop as well. That will be by the end of the week in email. But any questions, let us know. And thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the week. Thanks, Shareil.
Of course. Thanks, everyone.